Hello and welcome to Cricket8 podcast. I'm Megha and join me is Michelle. And today we're going to discuss about, among other things, should and can BCCI do more for world cricket? Now, just a while back, Michelle and I made a promise that we wouldn't end up in a fight at the end of this podcast. So let's see how it goes. There's already a very strong opinion waiting in the comment section. We'd bring that in and, of course, also invite your comments. But first and foremost, BCCI gets 40%, nearly 40% of ICC's revenues. And although, again, these numbers are speculations, but around 70 to 80% of the revenue generated by the ICC comes from the BCCI because Indian market is huge. And we've seen how the television timings, the prime time in India is accorded a lot of importance, more so in the recently concluded ICC T20 World Cup. So, Michelle, your opinion to begin with.
Do you know what? This is such a contentious topic and such a contentious issue. And I lay my cards out on the line straight away by saying that I'm looking at this with my West Indian supporting hat on. And I'm looking at it from the perspective of somebody who very much supports cricket in a region where we don't have a large TV share, we don't have a large audience share, but we do have a brand that is bigger than a lot of the other nations just because of what the West Indies have historically achieved in cricket. My concern with the kind of stake of control that the BCCI has over world cricket is that at some point, and then we've just had that big meeting, at Lords, and there's been lots written about it concerning maybe Test cricket has to shrink and this, that, and the third, right? But my ultimate concern is this, and this goes with any sport. We just so happen to be talking about cricket. If you shrink or allow the number of teams competing in a sport to shrink, ultimately, it may not be 5 years, it may not be 10, it could be 50, whatever it might be, but ultimately, the bigger teams lose out on in the end because what sells sport is competition. And we are, I think, on a slow but sure, like creeping journey to a stage where West Indies certainly become irrelevant. South Africa could become irrelevant. New Zealand could become irrelevant because when you're talking about things like audience share, TV share, market share, we're not big players in that market. But how many times is an audience willing to watch India versus Australia, India versus England, England versus Australia, before they turn around and go, this is good, this is elite cricket, but variety is the spice of life. And if the only way to ensure variety in cricket is to fund and give up some of the money to fund some of the other teams to not necessarily be competitive per se, but just exist, just be there in a wider market, then yes, I think the BCCI will probably have to do more because, and this is what I put back to you, Megha, is that how if Test cricket shrank, and we're talking purely in the context of Test cricket, and we might as well throw in ODI cricket as well. If those two formats shrank in terms of relevance and teams competing, how interesting would those products be? How interesting would those products be to the global cricket audience if it got smaller and more competitive?
Well, certainly not interesting. You need competition for any sport to thrive. But having said that, is money the only reason why West Indies is struggling, why South Africa is struggling? And I'd take this debate further and also incorporate the shorter formats, the limited overs format. For example, in case of South Africa, once SA20 came up, the revenues started shoring up. They became better. So, is it about managing the resources properly, doing the marketing bit well? For example, there were also concerns around the T20 World Cup with regards to people in attendance during the matches. It didn't make for a great TV viewership, the empty stands. And if you remember the T20 World Cup in Australia as well, it wasn't as well attended. So, are we focusing at the wrong point? Should it be more about how we can get more people interested, or should it be about how we can get more money? Because, for example, India, of course, there is this advantage of population. Even if there's a certain section of population that's losing interest in cricket, that's always getting substituted by a new set of audience base, a new audience base. So the population is an advantage. People taking that amount of interest in cricket is an advantage. But should it be more about ensuring that people take interest? For example, in India, once the IPL came, the BCCI was very clear about trying to tap in on a new market. It was
Mm,
turned into this, it was packaged in such a way that it could lure new audience, and that was a game changer. So the BCCI is making the amount of money it is making is because of how well it has managed things. And I go a bit, take a bit of historical context in as well. Jagmohan Dalmia, how he ensured that Asia was heard and BCCI was heard, and along with that, of course, there was Mr. Bindra as well. Both of them got together and got the other boats along in their mission, Pakistan, PCB, and Sri Lankan board as well. And that's how the turnaround came. And Asia got to host more matches, more World Cup editions. So all of that changed then because things were managed well. And subsequently there was ICL, and in response to ICL came the IPL. Now there are various other league based competitions that also mushroomed and did well initially across sports in the IPL model, but they did not in the long run thrive because probably they were not marketed well, probably they were not packaged well. But IPL kept rediscovering and reinventing itself. So is it down to managing what you have well, or is it down to just money? Because at the end of the day, whatever support comes, it cannot come forever. At the end of the day, the onus is also on whoever is managing, and I'm not just talking about the other boats. I'm talking also about the boats that I referred to, the federations that I referred to in India. Because in India, apart from the BCCI, we see that most other federations now they function very differently because BCCI is registered under the Societies Act. It does not take money from the government. Other associations, they are aligned, they are associated with the government, they get their funds from the government. But because they're not managed as well, they're not able to generate as much revenue because there's not as much interest in other sports, not as much revenue gets generated. So I'm just trying to look at this issue holistically without genuinely committing to a stand. But how much should we introspect on it beyond the monetary factor?
and I think you're right. I think you're right there to say what are, and that I think that's a common kind of thread or argument that I sometimes hear from people when they say, well, so again, using Cricket West Indies as an example. So what are Cricket West Indies doing to draw more interest in cricket within the region? And I think that's 100% a correct question to ask. However, I'm fairly certain that each cricket board and then their subsidiaries would all have their own kind of minute problems that they face that they would say other countries or regions don't understand. So again, using the West Indian context,
Yeah,
within the West Indies, of course, the West Indies isn't a country.
yeah,
It's a team which is made up of different countries: Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Barbados. And I think sometimes what I'm at pains to explain to people is because of them being nations in and of their own right, they don't have to listen to Cricket West Indies. Like it's not as straightforward as you are all within this nation and this private enterprise is running cricket in the nation, and therefore this is the directive coming down within the nation, right? And then if you have ineptitude within all that, you have ineptitude. What Cricket West Indies suggests should happen in cricket within the region. If Jamaica choose to ignore that, Jamaica choose to ignore that. If Barbados choose to adopt it, Barbados choose to adopt it. If Guyana says, well, actually, the money that we're getting, we're going to do our own thing. And I think it's just a bit harder to structure cricket when you're talking about actual sovereign nations and their as I've spoken to lots of stakeholders in West Indies cricket before who have always said to me, politics comes before cricket. Before you can have a cricket conversation going around the region, it's politicking first. Now, of course, somebody might say to me in the Indian context, well, yeah, when you go to whether it be Kolkata or if you're going here or if you're going there, there's politics that you have to discuss first before you can kind of get into the cricket, right? but it's just a unique scenario because it's sovereign nations within the Caribbean. And then I guess other kind of logistics I would throw in there again just in the Caribbean specific context is how much it costs to just travel within the region, right?
Hmm.
I was born in Jamaica. My parents live in Jamaica. If I go to Jamaica this summer to visit my parents, and let's say I decide, right, I'm going to go to Trinidad. Trinidad, from Jamaica to Trinidad, maybe 2.5 hours, 3 hours max. That'll cost me about 650 British pounds for that flight. That is ridiculous, right? Now, when you think about, therefore, establishing competitions, that's why when people look at the World Cup in the Caribbean and they say, why was it so hard on a logistic level to get it right? Well,
Yeah.
part of the problem is actually traveling in that region is very, very hard. It is not straightforward to get from nation to nation,
Hmm.
island to island. That a lot of meticulous planning has to go into place, and it runs up thousands upon thousands of dollars to make sure it all goes to hand. So I agree with you. Could cricket be run better in different places? Yes, undoubtedly. Do different jurisdictions have a level of concerns that don't afflict others? Yeah, I'd say so. But then to defend the BCCI, as much as our title
Hmm.
can say, what can India do for world cricket? I'm fairly certain that some people would say, well, hold on a minute. The Indian men's cricket team, we could talk about the women as well, but the Indians men's cricket team tours extensively,
Yeah.
right? And obviously, everyone talks about they only make money when India tour. In our case, we only make money when
Hmm.
India or England tour. And
England.
I
Yeah.
do think that India have done their fair share of touring. Right now, they're in Zimbabwe, right? I think they have
Hmm.
done their fair share of touring places, even with a B or a C team, to kind of say, well, you need a revenue share. Well, we'll turn up. Here's your
Yeah.
revenue share. But I guess I think the question's almost a bit of a misnomer because I
Hmm.
think what I'm more thinking about is the longevity of the world game. So rather
Yeah.
than what can India do for the West Indies, what can India do for New Zealand,
Hmm.
what can India do for Zimbabwe, I'm just thinking, are we entering a stage where 20 years from now we might look back and go, we knew we would get to this stage and we put our head in the sand and pretended like everything was going to be okay. And then 20 years later, we get to that stage where it's like, oh, there's not many teams playing this game anymore. Like,
Hmm.
do you know what I mean? And then I feel like it's almost like climate change, right? We can see it,
Hmm.
but a lot of people are denying what's going on and assuming
Hmm.
everything's just gonna be all right. And so I think that's
Hmm.
more so where my kind of conflict is in my head.
Hmm. So, in response to that, we've already discussed that there are things beyond money that can be done. And just to give credit where it's due to the BCCI, for example, in case of Bangladesh and Afghanistan, and we go back to 2000 when BCCI advocated very strongly for Bangladesh to be given the test status. And back then, Jagmohan Dalmia became
Mm,
the ICC president, the first Asian to take up that post. And Bangladesh got that test status. Now, what happened subsequently? Could they could they become the team? Could they become a force to reckon with outside home in the format? That hasn't happened yet, but at least they are making some strides, whether giant strides or not. Afghanistan is another example. Now,
mhm,
the dynamics are very different in case of Afghanistan. They cannot even play at home. So back in 2015, BCCI ensured that they got to play in Greater Noida. They were provided all the facilities that they needed. And then there was a time when they also had Dehradun as their home base. They have also had UAE as their home base, but these two venues in India helped them comprehensively. So Afghanistan has benefited considerably. Like you mentioned, that India does keep its taught commitments. Like recently, it sent a B team to Zimbabwe because immediately
mhm,
after the T20 World Cup, it wouldn't have been possible for the top stars to turn up. But in
mm,
any case, the commitment was honored, and even the relations between India and West Indies have been CWI have been good because India keeps touring. And recently, the CWI CEO also talked about how BCCI is already doing a lot, and echoing your points on the subject that more needs to be done overall for Test cricket to thrive. And one of the things that he pointed out was that although it is World Test Championship matches that we're talking about in Test cricket, but they function more like bilaterals, wherein the touring team has to fund its travel, and those
Mm.
costs can be mammoth for the smaller boats. And he also cited the example of West Indies' tour of England during COVID period, when peak COVID, with the restrictions around, it was very difficult to make that tour happen. But CWI honored its commitment, and that ensured that the show went on. But the cost bit that he talked about and how ICC should factor in, that's again the onus is on the ICC to make sure that it's easier. There is a relative level playing field for all, and logistics are taken care of by the ICC, is what he advocated. Now, quickly taking in some questions,
Mm.
Vibhor has been around for a while, I'm assuming, because his comment came in first, and he's got strong opinion on the subject. He says nothing more. Already billions is going out of the country. You probably need to take back some revenue share, maybe around 60% at least of what you are generating. Any other opinion is foolish. He'd not even allow us to have this conversation, because he has signed that off by saying any other conversation doesn't make sense. Then we also have Ruben. He says ICC overspent USD 20 millions to have the T20 World Cup in the USA, but then they're complaining that they don't have enough money to give to the other boards. Is it BCCI's fault that ICC spends without any control on the tournament? Now, this is another contentious topic,
Mm.
particularly about the US leg, how more funds were sought and how suddenly there was chaos and it was sought at the last moment. Some parties mentioned there were some resignations as well immediately after the
Mhm,
T20
mhm.
World Cup. Some parties mentioned that that was more as a loan, that was more to for immediate cash flow. But at the end of the day, there was more money spent than was accounted for. We've seen that for any major project that happens across spots. We see that happening. But in this particular case, there are also cases of mismanagement that we see coming to light every now and then.
So let's just address that question there from Ruban, because I'm intrigued to see where you stand on this one, Mega. What? Because also, again, because our moot question says, "What can India do for world cricket?" And then people, so Ruban in this sense is referring to the ICC, and is it the BCCI's fault that the ICC spend without any control? But who is the ICC? And I hope you get where I'm coming from with this, in so much as even I think what's the name of the president again? Barclay, I can't remember his first name, from the Kiwi. I think he said the other day, we're nothing really more than a members board, right? So I think this notion that the ICC have any real control of cricket, they're not really an entity, so to speak. The ICC is almost like a glorified events. What do I want to say here? They're almost like an events company, if you see what I mean. Like, we are going to take ownership over the hosting of this World Cup, and then this particular Champions Trophy, and then this World Cup, and so on and so forth. But in terms of actually governing the game, I guess I'm going to ask a contentious question: who's governing the game? So, and
Yeah. So to
That's not me trying to
hmm,
blame. I'm not trying to put. I don't want anyone to get
fair
this
enough.
wrong and say, "Am I blaming
Hmm,
BCCI?" I'm not. But I'm just saying,
hmm,
who's actually governing the game?
hmm. To answer that question and also to factor in what Ruben is already mentioning, he's talking about a particular instance of financial mismanagement, and
Mm,
there BCCI couldn't have been involved, because immediately once this news broke out, there were rumors and all random information floating around. But eventually, one got to know that it was to do with how the organizing committee in the US, whatever
mm,
fancy
mm, mm.
glorified name it carried, asked for more funds, and the funds that they were allotted, potentially, probably, they weren't managed well. And also, there were questions around the venues, the questions around the conditions, the pitches, so all of that as well. So that's one thing that we have to consider. And Avinash agrees with some of your points, and he also says, "Does do players want to play certain formats?" Now, we had been discussing how Test cricket in countries outside the big three is not thriving. So, for example, now here we have ample instances of players in those countries not taking Test cricket seriously. For example, in India's case, if India is playing a Test series, now India's case is slightly different because Indian players are not allowed to participate in the leagues happening around the world unless they've taken the retirement and have obtained the NOCs. But again, NOCs after retirement. Pakistan has again been a little discreet on the subject. They allowed two tournaments to their players, and they are revisiting that contract, and that might change as well. So in BCCI's case, because of the rules in place or whatever, at least whenever there's a test series happening, a marquee test series, or for that matter, test series of any nature, you see participation from the top players. Can the other boats or can the other teams claim the same in their case? Kane Williamson, highly respected cricketer, and due respect to him, of course, but he has taken a call. He has refused to be a part of the New Zealand contract system. He wants to also commit to SA20 and some other leagues. So fair enough at this juncture of his career, considering the truckloads of runs that he has scored for the New Zealand team, and the way he has led them with a lot of dignity. He has the right to make all the choice in the world. But the question boils down to the fact that there are players who are in other countries who are prioritizing. In Kane Williamson's case, we cannot discriminate between formats, but at least in other countries where they are prioritizing franchise cricket and T20 cricket, T20Is for that matter, over Test cricket. They want to be fresh for T20I. So, are the other countries, and England, of course, is an exception, so is Australia. They take their Test cricket very seriously, and that's the reason, one of the reasons why they're so competitive. But are the players prioritizing the format?
I think I read an article from Neil Manthorpe the other day where he said that coming out of that meeting at the MCC the other day, where they were discussing, like, I
Yeah,
guess, the state of the game, the one representative that wasn't there was no players representative. So
yeah.
there was all these ex-players, there was board members, this, that, but there was no actual FICA wasn't there, or what, they're not called FICA anymore, but the Players Representative Union wasn't there.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, FICA, I think, released some data, I think a couple of months ago, maybe a month ago, where they said that only, can't remember the exact figure, but the number of players who prefer formats is more and more
Yeah,
T20s,
yeah, yeah.
T20 is increasing, Test cricket is decreasing. But I think the point I'm trying to get to here is that for me, it's both a monetary point here, and it's also a prioritization point here.
Hmm.
I think we're getting to a stage, and I don't know if this veers away from the main question that we asked at the beginning of the show, but we're getting to a stage where if cricket wants to save itself, so maybe the point here isn't what can India do for world cricket, but what can all the teams do for world cricket. We're getting
And
to a
Test cricket
point,
in particular in this
yeah,
case,
exactly,
right?
Test cricket in particular. Thank you. We're getting to a point here where if we do not establish windows for specifically for Test cricket, I think we are entering a stage where Test cricket will die a natural death for certain teams because there's no financial justification to keep doing it,
Yeah.
and that the T20 leagues will reign supreme. Now, if I'm a current cricket player, of course I'm going to prefer the T20 leagues, but I dare any current player to tell me that they prefer T20 cricket as a product. They prefer T20 cricket because they get paid well. That's why they prefer
Hmm.
T20. I'm not buying all of this. Oh, I really prefer T20 cricket. No, you prefer T20 cricket because it's unregulated. You can make as much money as you want going from league to league to league to league, and it's less work, right? For a lot of the players. And
Yeah.
right now, the West Indies players are going to be sitting in that field for however many overs until England declare or whatever it might be, right? That's a lot of work, right? Whereas you can go and hit a ball, what, 50 times and get paid really well in T20 cricket, right? So um, I think it's more so. So I'm almost now arguing against my original
Hmm.
point. I think it's more so.
I'll have to switch points. I'll have to switch my stand in that case to balance it out.
Okay, but yeah, I think it's more so rather than what can India do. Actually, no. Do you know what? Actually, Megha, let me still try and stay on my
Hmm.
point.
All right.
Can in is okay. Okay, let me phrase this. Let me get this right before people get in the comments and get angry. Does India slash the BCCI have the power
Hmm.
to force the other cricket associations boards to create windows that save the test game?
Hmm.
Does the BCCI have the levers of power to fast forward what I think is the next obvious stage of protecting Test cricket in particular, or would they prefer to play the lucrative series against England and Australia? And if Oddity, because Ravi Shastri was saying the other day, well, boy, it just
Yeah.
needs to reduce to 6 teams. So where do you stand on that line? Are you down the Ravi Shastri line, which is, well, if it's going to reduce to 6, that's global economics. That's what happens in the market. So be it. Or do you
Mm.
think the BCCI has the power to be able to say to other boards, no, let's protect Test cricket for the weaker nations as well, but here's what we're going to do to protect it?
The question is, do the windows exist? Considering how cramped cricket calendar is,
Mm,
can those windows be realistically created? Because in an idealistic scenario, we do talk about those windows. And again, there is this question about how can we hype up the interest around test cricket, because remember, in general there was a period in between where there were questions raised on the existence of ODI cricket, and the
mm, mm,
conversations, the discourse around that time was that T20Is would thrive, uh, test cricket would continue to exist because that is the real cricket, and ODIs might just be sacrificed in the process for the two of those to exist. But then came 2023 edition of the World Cup. It was staged in India. That might lead us to another debate, because staging
mm,
rights too should be equally distributed between the boards. But just sticking to this particular point, they happen in India, and considering the fact that a tournament like an ODI World Cup happens over a period of around 2 months or 1.5 months, in that scenario, there is slow simmer because the interest builds gradually, and by the
mm,
time we arrive at the finals, there is enormous interest already created. So, having seen the interest that the ODI World Cup managed to generate, all the stakeholders, all the fans were forced to revisit their thought, their perception, and the conversations around 50 overs cricket dying was they were put to rest, at least for the time being.
mm,
That cannot happen in case of World Test Championship. ICC managed to create World Test Championship because they wanted more context around Test cricket, and of course, the context has been imparted. But we also see England not taking it as seriously, at least from the evidence of what we've already seen. They're already talking about the Ashes, although
mm, mm,
they
mm,
won comprehensively in the first Test, but they're already talking about the Ashes, which is a year and a half down the line. So, in case of Test cricket, even with the World Test Championship, third edition too would be held at the same venue, that is in England. And then there cannot be that sort of interest around the World Test Championships finals. And India have featured in both the editions, and yet in India, it did not garner enormous interest because there was no proper build up for the event. It happened
mm,
immediately after the IPL. It was happening in England, and before the event, before that one off game, there was not much of a build up. There's another
mm,
question that is very interesting to our conversation. Swaminathan talks about how India takes in less money on per capita basis than other cricketing nation. Country has more cricketers to feed. Now, you talked about the Players Association. India does not have one fully functional.
mm,
And quickly, to sum up this point, there are also conversations around how BCCI one needs to help other sporting boards in India, how BCCI needs to also take care of its former cricketers, age group level cricketers, although former cricketers do have pension scheme depending on the number of matches they've represented India in, and women's cricket as well needs to be taken care of. So already a lot on the plate. Fair enough argument that more needs to be done for global cricket, but your thoughts on how do you, in the context of our conversation, how do you see things shaping up? And in case, because we are short on time, in case you want to take some more questions, we have those. Hugh has been making multiple points, including the semi-final clash. I think you've already read it. That's why that's that laugh. And Ritik here says that just like all other host nations, uh, have known where they'll play the games. Okay, so he's responding to Hugh, and for those who are listening to us and not watching us, the point that Hugh is making over here is how can India know where they play the semi-finals ahead of the other teams? This raised a lot of this sparked a lot of debates online. Your thoughts on the same?
I mean, it's no different to me than when we have a World Cup or Champions Trophy and India and Pakistan get drawn in the same group, right?
Yeah.
Money is money is king, TV is king, right? I personally would prefer world cricket or international cricket to follow the same kind of structure as how like a football World Cup would be structured, which is it's actually a draw. Like it's
Hmm,
actually a
hmm.
proper draw, and we don't know who's going to be in the same groups, and we don't know how it's all going to pattern, and so on and so forth. I think that makes a bit of a and there's certain things about international cricket and cricket as a whole where it's still a bit of an antiquated game where we do
Hmm.
things just because that's how it was always done, and we're just going to keep
Yeah,
doing it. Like it's a very slow moving game in terms of modernizing
yeah.
itself. But there was a point you made earlier on that I think it was off the back of that per capita point. And do you know what, Meg? I'm going to make this point, and then what I'm going to
Hmm.
say to the listeners is this: Megha and I are obviously going to have to do a part two on this one because there's so many different points to this type of question. There's so many different points to this, and we're barely touching the surface in half an
Yeah.
hour. So I leave with this particular point, and then I'll give you the right of reply, Megha, and then we'll deliberately lock it off after that and let everyone get in the comments and argue about it. Maybe the best thing that India can do for world cricket. This is my final conclusion. Maybe the best thing India can do for world cricket is that all World Cups going forward, one in every two should be hosted in India. And the revenue share that comes off that
Hmm.
gets distributed in a way that helps the other nations.
You know,
I need to
India
flesh this
would.
idea out. So I'm basically saying move the World Cups
Hmm.
to the biggest market. So all of this
Hmm.
complaints about why are we kicking off? Sorry, why are games starting at 10:30 in the morning? Well, duh, it's for
Yeah,
the Asian
Indian
market,
audience.
right? Well, let's get round that by just
Hmm.
moving most of the World Cups to obviously Australia and England can get some as well, but move most of the World Cups to India. We get
Hmm.
rid of the audience debate because it's already where the audience is. It just means that the share, the profit margin that comes off it, let's just share that a bit more. Let's have a kind of equitable share off the back of that. And
Hmm.
I'm not saying that fixes everything, but
Yeah.
that's my new that's a theory that I'm working on going
Hmm.
forward. I'll give you the right of
Hmm.
reply on that.
And I'll give you food for thought in that because India would love this opportunity. But I've been constantly harping on a point, and a lot of people would disagree with me that it's not all about money. We hear that quite often in our day-to-day lives as well. The fact that when a World Cup is staged in a certain country, there is a certain level of interest that gets generated because the
Mm,
carnival is in your town, is in your country.
mhm,
So you
mhm,
just feed off that energy, that buzz, and subsequently you are interested in other meaningless bilateral, quote unquote, meaningless bilateral matches as well. So probably this idea might be contentious on that front as well. But to conclude this conversation, we are having this debate because cricket is relatively a close knit community. We do not have
mm,
200 countries playing cricket. In case of football, we wouldn't even be having this conversation.
mm,
It's the England body, that's FA, that makes the most money. And then there are others down in the pegging order, but maybe the ones ranked 50th or 100th would be making way less money. But here we are not talking about the money being shared. And England, of course, has EPL. BCCI has IPL, but when the players from the other boards participate, from the other countries participate in the IPL, the other boards are benefiting as well because a certain share goes to them.
mm,
So it's not like other boards are not benefiting out of the IPL, and that's why, in terms of window, there is one virtual window that exists, and that exists for the IPL. And I've wondered about this over and over again. England came up with the 100. Before that, there was this Big Bash League for Australia. Their top notch players themselves are not participating in
mm,
those competitions. So, what precedence is that setting? While in case of the IPL, it's very clear. It's not just that the Indian players prioritize that because that's probably the only league that they play unless they're retired. The other leagues they do not feature in, but the other countries as well, the other players as well, they are prioritizing the IPL because Indians themselves take it so seriously. And of course, there is a lot more money at stake. So maybe there is no right or wrong here, and we are exploring all that lies in between, and probably we continue to explore that because this topic has just picked up steam, and we'll have to conclude it here because it's already 35 minutes. But thank you so much for your opinion, and thanks to all of those who pitched in the comment section. We'd await more comments, more opinions, even after we've signed off in the comment section down below. Thank you so much as of now for joining.
Thank you, everyone.